And what's going on, guys? Welcome to another video lecture. So today we're going to talk about medieval Japan. And at this point, we're really well into our Unit 4 notes, right? We've already covered the Mongols, we've covered China under the Ming Dynasty, and now we're going to talk about Japan, which is very interesting. And I think this will be the last one for this unit. I might go on to cover Korea and Southeast Asia, but I don't think I'll give you like a whole set of notes on it. And it is important that you guys copy these notes into your Google Slides. And it's up to you if you have them all under one set of slides, the Mongols, China, and now Japan, or if you just have like your own little slides working for each one. As long as you know where they are each time, that's all that really matters to me. So just make sure you have them, because I'm planning on probably giving you guys the unit test next week. And you guys have already taken a quiz, so you kind of have an idea on how the test will be, and it will be heavily based on the notes that I give you along with some of the videos. But don't worry, we'll do a whole unit review. We'll have like a session, live chats, all that sort of thing. So I'll make sure you guys are all ready, but please make sure you have your notes, because that's going to be the most important thing when it comes to taking the test. So you don't have to copy this first slide that you see up right now. This would have been our do now if we were in class. And the video was the way, what is Bushido, which is the way of the warrior, right? And Bushido was basically like the code of conduct that all samurai during the medieval Japan period had to live by, right? So it's very reminiscent or similar to the Knights' Code of Chivalry, right, which we covered when we did medieval Europe. All of the knights had to swear loyalty to their lord, and they had to live by a certain code where they had certain things that were most important and all that. It's very similar for the samurai. The samurai were the warrior class in medieval Japan, and they also had to swear their loyalty to their lord, known as a daimyo. We'll get more into that in a second. And they lived by Bushido, which had 7 virtues, and they had to honor all of these virtues. And if for any reason any of the samurai failed to live up to these 7 virtues, then there was this very famous ceremonial suicide that they would commit, known as seppuku, where they would stab themselves with their own katana in their stomach and disembowel themselves and die, because it was more honorable to end your own life than to live a dishonorable life because you couldn't follow the way of the Bushido. So if that sounds kind of hardcore, get ready, because medieval Japan is one of the most hardcore civilizations we're going to talk about, maybe rivaling the Mongols, right? So we're going to get into that now. So the first slide we're going to cover, this is the first one you're going to copy. And just the way we started China, we're going to do the basics of Japan, right? So I know, talking to you guys, you're like this new younger generation. Most of you, I think, are familiar with China, Japan, Korea as different countries, but that's you guys. Believe it or not, most Americans, and especially the older generations, they don't really know the difference between all these nations. So I like to start off by just giving a couple of basics. There is a difference between China and Japan, very different nations, even though they are neighbors. So the interesting thing about Japan is that even though it is an island nation and it's not some huge thing on the map, it is actually the 3rd wealthiest country in the world, which makes it very important, right? If you remember, the 2nd wealthiest country in the world, which we did last time, was China, and the 1st wealthiest is the United States, right? But when you think about China, one of the reasons why their economy is so massive is because they produce so many of the world's products, right? How many things do we have are made in China? Now, in Japan, they're an extremely wealthy nation, not because they produce so many things, but because the things that they do produce are very valuable. Think about it. Probably the most expensive thing that every person expects to own one day, right? You might think, oh, maybe a laptop, maybe a cell phone, maybe some sneakers. But the most expensive thing that every individual will probably own one day is a car. I don't care if you get some bootleg old raggedy car, it's still going to be worth a few $1,000s, right? So if you can be one of the leaders in manufacturing and selling cars, then you can make yourself a lot of money, because every single one of you probably expect to own your own car one day, right? And that's going to be pretty expensive, right? Japan is the leader in car sales, right? When you think of the most popular Japanese car brands, you're going to think of Toyota, Honda, Nissan. And not only are the most popular Japanese cars, they're the most popular cars in the world. I think Toyota is one of the largest companies in the world. And so you make a lot of money if you can manufacture all of these and sell all of these. And even some of the other things that Japan is famous for manufacturing are also still kind of expensive things. So you probably heard of Sony, or if you've ever played PlayStation, guess what? That's Sony, and that's a Japanese company. And also Nintendo. So when you think about game consoles, technology, and cars, those are very popular, very expensive compared to, the things that China makes, for example, like, your spoons or your furniture. Sometimes it's not really as expensive as some of these things. So Japan is a very wealthy nation because they produce some high-end products that we're all very familiar with, right? We've all seen a Toyota, and we've all played Nintendo, right? And all of these come straight out of Japan. A couple other things about Japan is that it is an island nation, and it doesn't look as big on the map, but really the islands do stretch across a large area, right? So if we were to put Japan right next to the East Coast, it would stretch from about Maine, or like just north of New York, all the way down to Florida, right? So it is bigger than it seems on the map. And it does have the 10th largest population in the world, and has probably the second largest city in the world. Most of you guys, I think, have heard of Tokyo. It's right up there with New York City as one of the largest cities in the world. And a couple of other famous Japanese cities you might have heard of: Osaka and Kyoto. And Kyoto, we're going to talk a lot more, because Kyoto was the old capital. So when we talk about medieval Japan, Kyoto is going to be the capital, and we're going to mention that a little bit more, right? So that's just some information about Japan, modern Japan. And now let's do a deep dive into Japan in the medieval period. So hopefully by now you realize that we're talking about every country, every continent in the world, but at the medieval period, right? So at the same time that knights were riding around in castles in Europe, and the same time that the Muslims were conquering North Africa and the Middle East, at the same time that the Mongols were conquering all of Asia, this is what was going on in Japan, right? So first thing you got to know is that Japan had existed as a civilization, or as an empire, for a very long time, more than 2,000 years old, right? So the first imperial family supposedly got power around 600 BCE. So you guys remember the Romans? How we talked about how the Romans originally had kings, and then they got rid of them to create the Roman Republic. At the same time that the Roman Republic was being created, that's when Japan's first emperors were taking control of Japan, right? So we're talking about a very, very ancient civilization at this point, right? And I think Japan has the longest imperial family in the world, right? So we know for a fact that their imperial family, which to this day Japan still has an emperor, right? Even though it doesn't really have any power, it's kind of like Queen Elizabeth in England. They go back 120 generations, and it's the longest running imperial family in the world. Because even Queen Elizabeth, I think their family only goes back like, I think maybe 15 generations, not that much actually. But so the country has been very old. It was ruled by emperors, but by the time we get into the medieval period, clans, which were like loosely related family groups who controlled a certain area, rebelled against the emperors, and they kind of wanted to take control for themselves. They weren't happy with the imperial rule. And Japan kind of breaks out into this like kind of a civil war situation. And what I compare it to is like gangs, right? So I don't know if you guys are too familiar with gangs, but if you have one gang on one side of the town and another gang on the other side of town, they will usually fight each other for control over the territory. That's basically what was happening in Japan during this time period. But instead of gangs, we have clans, right? And each clan wanted to control as much territory as they could so that they could eventually control the entire nation of Japan. And they would fight each other. And the way to prove that you were the dominant clan was simply by being the stronger clan with the better fighters. And this is why the samurai become so important in Japan, because the samurai were basically the warriors of this time period. They were famous for walking around with their katanas and ready to fight any other clan at any time. And we'll get more into that in a second, but it's just I'm trying to illustrate to you guys what Japan was like. At this time, everybody either belonged to a clan or lived under a clan, and they were trying to fight to control Japan. And basically, the group that would end up controlling the country was the group that would be able to control Kyoto, which was the capital of Japan, and that's where the emperor lived. So the emperor was still important, in name only. They still honored the emperor, but the emperor really didn't have any power, right? So if you were the leader of the clan that would take over Kyoto, then you would basically tell the emperor, okay, make sure you tell everybody that I'm in charge now. And so the emperor is important because they're symbolically there as the leaders, and they'll say, okay, well, now Mr. Lee's clan is in charge. And if he doesn't do what I tell him to do, then, I'll kill him. And I'll take another member of the imperial family and I'll make them do it. That's kind of the way it worked. At this point, it was safe to say that people lived by the katana, or by the sword. And it was kind of like a video game. Like if you were a clan, let's say we were a clan, let's say we were the Lee clan. If we wanted to become the dominant clan, we would just have to find samurai, train them, make sure they're better warriors than everybody else, and we would fight our way to the top. We'd fight this clan, then that clan, and eventually making our way into Kyoto. Kyoto would be like the final level. And if we conquered Kyoto, where the emperor's palace is, then we would be the ruling clan. And as the leader of that clan, I would be your daimyo, right? And we're going to talk about that more in a second, but the daimyo were the leaders of the clan. And if you were the daimyo that controlled Kyoto, and then that would make you the shogun, because you control all of Japan. But Japan was under this situation for about 200 years, where every clan was just constantly fighting one another for control of Japan. And it was brutal. Everybody had a sword, everybody had to fight. And if you were a regular person, a peasant or a merchant or store owner, whatever, you were just constantly trying to stay out of the way of the samurai, because at any point, if you got in the way, it wouldn't be crazy for the samurai just to cut you down for getting in their way. And it was a brutal time to be alive in Japan. Now, with that said, we do have to kind of focus on the social structure that existed in Japan. And I kind of mentioned before that it was very similar to the medieval European social structure. So maybe you guys remember the feudal system, where in Europe it was a pyramid, and at the very top would be the king, or actually technically God, right? And the Pope would have to crown the king. And then under the king, you had the lords. And then under the lords, you had the vassals. And then under the vassals, you had the knights. And then below the knights, you had your peasants, right? That was the feudal system in Europe. And it's very interesting because we had a very similar social structure in Japan. It was known as the Bakufu. So you want to remember that. That'll be on your quiz. And the Bakufu social structure was similar, right? Now, you should probably try to compare it in your mind. But obviously, instead of the king on top, we're going to have the emperor. And for a long time, the emperor really did have power. But as I've explained, during this time period, the emperor was very much just symbolic, right? Didn't have that much power, just was at the top. The true ruler of Japan was the shogun. And the shogun was whichever daimyo or lord, clan leader, managed to take over Kyoto and had the emperor's recognition as the shogun. And the shogun was the most powerful samurai, because usually the samurai, the daimyo were also samurai. They were all fighters. And the shogun is the guy that had all of the power, because every other daimyo had to swear loyalty to them, and they would pay taxes to them. And that's where all their power came from. But at any point in time, a rival clan with their own daimyo could challenge the shogun. And in Japan, it wasn't uncommon for one-on-one samurai battles to take place. And the shogun would have to fight another daimyo, or their clan would fight the other clan. And Hopefully the shogun wins, but if he loses, then now you're out and the new clan gets to claim. And this was kind of how it went on for a long time. But let's say you're the shogun, you just took over Kyoto. Now every other daimyo is loyal to you. So you're the top daimyo. So you're the highest on the pyramid, you're the shogun. Under the shogun, you have the daimyo, and the daimyo are basically the clan leaders. They're like the lords, and they generally owned a piece of land, a territory that was inherited, from their parents, right? Or maybe it was given to them by the shogun. But basically, you were in charge of your territory, right? And everybody in your territory pays taxes to you, but you have to then pay taxes to your shogun. Now, if you don't like that shogun, maybe one day you can challenge them and try to become the next shogun. But for right now, you're the daimyo and you have to pledge loyalty to your shogun. Now, under the daimyo are the samurai. So Japan was filled with these warriors who were known as the samurai, very skilled warriors with the katanas. But a samurai couldn't just do whatever they wanted. They had to swear their loyalty to a daimyo. So if I lived in Bloomfield and I'm a samurai, I have to pledge loyalty to the daimyo of Bloomfield. And the daimyo of Bloomfield pledges loyalty to the shogun. That's basically how it works. Now, the samurai are free to do what they want, but the moment the daimyo calls them, to battle because the Bloomfield daimyo is going to fight the Nutley or the Montclair or the Glen Ridge daimyo, then we have to report as the samurai. That's what we do, and we pledge our loyalty to that daimyo. We do whatever that daimyo says. Underneath the samurai is this very interesting character known as the ronin. Now, a ronin is a samurai who doesn't swear loyalty to anyone. Now, the only way this can happen is if their daimyo has died. Maybe they were killed or maybe they died naturally, but the samurai is still alive. Samurai do not typically swear their loyalty to someone else. They might switch their loyalty to the son of their daimyo, but if their daimyo was killed and there is nobody else, then that samurai is now free to do whatever they'd like. In Japan, usually they hated ronin because this makes you a very dangerous person. The samurai are highly skilled swordsmen, but at least they always had to do whatever their daimyo said. But now that you're a ronin, you don't have a daimyo, you are free to do whatever you want. And ronins are usually the figures around a lot of very famous Japanese legends, movies, anime. One of my favorite animes of all time is Rurouni Kenshin, which is about a ronin who wanders the countryside, and everybody knows him as this famous samurai, but he's kind of like, no, I don't do that anymore. But that's technically that whole idea of the ronin. Their their daimyo has passed away, and so they just wander with no purpose, because a samurai without a daimyo, without somebody to fight for, has no purpose. That's kind of like the romantic legend of a ronin. And underneath this is going to be everyone else. These are going to be the peasants, the artisans, the merchants. They live, regular lives, running their stores, farming the land, growing their rice. But these other three classes are always above them: the samurai, the daimyo, and the shogun. So what you have here is just, your typical pyramid. We had to have a pyramid. So like I said, at the top, we have the emperor, and then we have the shogun. Remember, the emperor doesn't really have any power. It's just symbolic. The shogun has all the power, and the shogun is just the daimyo that has conquered Kyoto and rules over all of the other daimyo. So underneath the shogun, you have the regular daimyo. And if you watch the video, you know that there's different classes of daimyo and all that. I'm not going to get into that. But then underneath the daimyo, you have the samurai. These are the warriors. These are like the knights who swore loyalty to their lord. You have the samurai who swear loyalty to their daimyo. And underneath the samurai, you have the peasants, everybody else in Japan. That's the Bakufu, right? That's the Japanese social structure. Make sure you remember that, all right? Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about just a little bit today, but our next lesson is going to get really into it, is the person who's going to end this time period of constant fighting in Japan. It's going to be a guy named Tokugawa Ieyasu. And now you want to remember, in Japan, the last name comes first. So Tokugawa is their last name, and everybody else we talk about, that name you hear first is their last name. Now, Tokugawa Ieyasu was a daimyo. He was from the Tokugawa clan, and he was allies with Oda Nobunaga, which we're going to talk a lot more. But basically, after Oda commits seppuku, he gets ambushed, and before letting anybody else kill him, Oda decides to kill himself by committing seppuku. Tokugawa eventually, through a lot of politics and a lot of fighting, eventually becomes the shogun, right? And he becomes the last shogun because he institutes a lot of new rules and laws that kind of brings an end to the constant infighting. And probably the most important thing he did was, instead of ruling from Kyoto like every other shogun had done, he decided, you know what? Instead of protecting Kyoto, I'm going to move the capital of Japan to where my clan is from, which was Edo. Now, Edo doesn't sound familiar to you now, but eventually they would change the name of Edo to Tokyo, which is the modern day capital of Japan. And by moving the capital to Edo, where his clan had been for hundreds of years and historically has always owned it, he kind of changed everything. The game was different now. You're not fighting all these other clans to try to control Kyoto. Now it's Edo, and you have no shot at trying to control Edo because it's always been Tokugawa territory instead of Kyoto that had always constantly been fought over, right? And not only that, what Tokugawa does, which is really smart, is he decides to retire as the shogun. Even though he was still young enough to be shogun, but he retires and lets his son be the next shogun. So that kind of made it so that by the time Tokugawa does die, people were used to his son being in charge. And so there was no great war after his death where everybody's like, no, we're going to take over. We'll be the next one. When he dies, people are used to his son being in charge, and his son just becomes the next shogun without any big deal, right? So that was important. And under Tokugawa, he passes a whole bunch of new laws that are really interesting. He makes sure that nobody can ever become a samurai now unless they were born into it. Before that, if you were a skilled swordsman, you could become a samurai. And if you were the best samurai in your clan, you could become a daimyo. And if you were the best daimyo and you conquered all of the other clans around you and you made it to Kyoto, then you could be the shogun. That was the way it worked, right? It was a system that rewarded the best warriors. Under Tokugawa, he decides, no, we're going to have peace. And samurai, instead of you being able to become a samurai, you have to be born into it. So now it's really sounding like Europe, where you had to be born into being a noble or a lord. You had to be born into being a samurai. So even if you were a very skilled swordsman, but you were born a peasant, too bad. You don't get that opportunity. And over time, over a few generations, the samurai, since there's been peace all over Japan and the clans are not really fighting with one another, eventually the samurai themselves are no longer these tremendously skilled swordsmen, and they begin focusing more on the arts and becoming cultural leaders, and they become like these elites, right, who are just like the upper class of Japan. And by the end of the Tokugawa Shogunate, the idea of the samurai as warriors has almost completely gone away. Most samurai don't even know how to fight anymore. Most samurai don't even carry their katanas anymore. So Tokugawa, in one way, is very successful because he ends this crazy period of violence in Japan. But for those of us who were big fans of that time period, Tokugawa is the one who puts an end to it. And he does it so that he and his family can stay in control of Japan for as long as he can. It does last all the way up until 1868, which, when you think about it, that's basically modern times. That's when the shogunate is going to end, and they get into this new period known as the Meiji Restoration. But that's where we're going to end it for medieval Japan. And if you haven't already watched the video, then please make sure you watch the video. That's going to explain to you more about the Bakufu and about how all this works with shoguns, daimyos, and samurai. And next class, we're going to get really into the story of Tokugawa and also all these other clan leaders and how they got control of Japan. So hope this wasn't too long for you guys, and I'll see you next time. Have a nice day.